Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing in a temple built over 4,000 years ago. The air is thick with incense, and the walls around you are covered in wedge-shaped symbols pressed into clay tablets. These aren't just decorations, they're messages from a civilization that claimed to have walked and talked with gods. Gods who descended from the heavens. Gods who, according to some researchers, might be the very same deity billions worship today under a different name. What if I told you that Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the foundation of Judaism, Christianity and Islam, might have originated not as the one true God, but as a member of an ancient pantheon? What if the tablets of Sumer, humanity's first known civilization, contain evidence that challenges everything we've been taught about the origins of monotheism? This is not a story about disproving faith. This is a story about uncovering history, about following the evidence wherever it leads, even into the most uncomfortable territories of human belief. Tonight, we descend into the cradle of civilization itself to examine a claim so controversial it has ignited fierce debates among scholars, theologians, and ancient astronaut theorists alike. The claim that the God of the Bible was originally one of the Anunnaki, the mysterious gods of ancient Mesopotamia. Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The mainstream academic world will tell you with absolute certainty that Yahweh, the God of Israel, emerged sometime in the late Bronze Age, around 1400 to 1300 BCE, among a group of Semitic peoples in the southern Levant and northern Arabia. His origins, they say, are obscure but traceable through archaeological evidence, ancient inscriptions, and the careful linguistic analysis of Hebrew and related languages. This is the foundation we must understand before we can examine the alternative theories. The scholarly consensus holds that Yahweh was not originally Canaanite. He does not appear in the Ugaritic texts, the extensive corpus of religious writings from ancient Ugarit in modern-day Syria that detail the Canaanite pantheon in exquisite detail. The chief god of the Canaanites was El, the father of the gods, often depicted as a wise elderly figure who presided over the divine council from his mountain abode. El had a consort, Asherah, the mother goddess, and among their divine offspring was Baal, the storm god, who became one of the most popular deities in Canaan. But Yahweh is conspicuously absent from these Canaanite god lists. The earliest extra-biblical reference to Yahweh comes from Egyptian inscriptions dating to the 14th century BCE. These texts mention Yahweh in the land of the Shasu, referring to nomadic peoples in the regions of Edom, Midian, and Seir, areas south and east of Canaan in what is now southern Israel, Jordan, and northwestern Saudi Arabia. This has given rise to what scholars call the Kenite or Midianite hypothesis. This theory proposes that Yahweh originated as a deity worshipped by these nomadic groups, particularly the Kenites, who were metalworkers and possibly miners. Some scholars, like Nissim Amzalag from Ben-Gurion University, have proposed that Yahweh was originally a god of metallurgy and the forge, associated with copper mining operations in the Timna Valley and other sites in the southern Arabah. The Bible itself provides tantalizing hints of this southern origin. In some of the oldest poetic passages in the Hebrew scriptures, Yahweh is described as coming from Seir, from Edom, from the region of Sinai. The Song of Deborah, in Judges chapter 5, one of the most ancient texts in the Bible, declares that when Yahweh went out from Seir, when he marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens poured. The question that scholars debate endlessly is how this deity, possibly originating among nomadic metallurgists in the desert, became the national god of Israel and eventually transformed into the one universal god of monotheism. The process was neither simple nor quick. Archaeological evidence and biblical scholarship suggest that early Israelite religion was not monotheistic at all. The Israelites, who emerged as a distinct group in the hill country of Canaan around 1200 BCE, worshipped multiple deities. They venerated El, the Canaanite high god, alongside Yahweh. In fact, many biblical passages preserve traces of this earlier polytheism. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, contains one of the most revealing passages, preserved in ancient manuscripts like the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Greek Septuagint. It reads, "When the Most High El Elyon gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. and Yahweh's portion was his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance. This text explicitly presents Yahweh not as the supreme creator God, but as one of the sons of El, assigned by the Most High to rule over Israel, while other divine beings received other nations. It's a glimpse into a time when the Israelites believed in a divine hierarchy, a council of gods presided over by El. Over time, something remarkable happened. Yahweh and El began to merge. The process scholars call conflation resulted in Yahweh absorbing the titles, attributes, and authority of El. By the time of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, this merger was largely complete. Yahweh was no longer one God among many. He was proclaimed to be the only God, the creator of heaven and earth, and all other so-called gods were demoted to the status of powerless idols or rebellious angels. This is the mainstream scholarly view, based on decades of archaeological excavation, linguistic analysis, and comparative study of ancient Near Eastern religions. It's a view that acknowledges the complex, gradual evolution of Israelite religion, from polytheism to monolatry, the worship of one God while acknowledging the existence of others, to true monotheism. But there is another perspective, a far more controversial one that asks a simple but profound question. What if this merger between Yahweh and El was not a theological evolution, but a cover story? What if Yahweh was never a vague storm deity or forge god, but something far more concrete and far more unsettling? To understand the alternative theory, we must first travel back to southern Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BCE to the land of Sumer. Here, in the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, humanity's first urban civilization flourished. The Sumerians gave us writing, the wheel, complex mathematics, and some of the most sophisticated astronomical knowledge of the ancient world. They also left us thousands of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform script, detailing their history, their laws, their economics, and crucially, their religion. At the centre of Sumerian religion was a group of powerful deities called the Anunnaki. In the Sumerian language, Anunnaki means princely offspring or offspring of An, referring to An or Anu, the god of heaven. These were not minor spirits or nature deities. The Anunnaki were the supreme council of gods who governed the cosmos and determined the fates of both gods and humans. The most prominent Anunnaki included Anu, the distant sky god and supreme authority; Enlil, the god of wind, storm and earth, who functioned as the chief executive deity and whose temple at Nippur was the religious centre of Sumer; Enki, also called Ea, the god of fresh water, wisdom, magic and creation, who dwelt in the Abzu, the subterranean ocean of fresh water beneath the earth, Ninhursag, the mother goddess, and Inanna, later known as Ishtar, the goddess of love, war, and fertility. The Sumerian texts describe these gods in remarkably human-like terms. They had families, rivalries, and conflicts. They established cities, appointed kings, and demanded tribute. They were not abstract spiritual forces, but personalities who walked the earth, built temples, and directly intervened in human affairs. According to mainstream Assyriology, the field that studies ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, these gods are mythological personifications of natural forces, cosmic principles, and social structures. The stories about them are religious poetry, not historical records. But in 1976, a Russian-born Israeli author named Zecharia Sitchin published a book that would change everything. It was called The 12th Planet, and it proposed a radical reinterpretation of Sumerian mythology. Sitchin claimed to have translated the ancient cuneiform tablets and discovered that the Anunnaki were not gods at all. They were extraterrestrials, physical flesh and blood beings from another planet who came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago in search of gold. According to Sitchin's theory, the Anunnaki hailed from a planet called Nibiru, which he claimed was depicted on ancient cylinder seals and described in Babylonian astronomical texts. Nibiru, he said, followed a vast elliptical orbit that brought it into the inner solar system once every 3,600 years. During one of these passages, the Anunnaki descended to Earth, established mining operations, particularly in Africa, and eventually created Homo sapiens through genetic engineering, mixing their own DNA with that of Homo erectus to produce a hybrid worker species. Humanity was designed to be a slave race labouring in the gold mines for our alien creators. Sitchin's narrative didn't stop there. He wove together the mythology of Sumer, Babylon, and the Hebrew Bible into a single grand chronicle. He identified specific Anunnaki gods with specific roles. Enki, he said, was the chief scientist who genetically engineered humans and repeatedly intervened to save them from the harsher plans of his rival Enlil. Enlil was the strict, authoritarian commander who grew tired of humanity's noise and multiplication and decided to wipe them out with a great flood, an event Sitchin links directly to the biblical story of Noah. The flood narratives in Sumerian literature, particularly the story of Atrahasis and the flood account in the Epic of Gilgamesh, were not myths, but historical records of a real cataclysm. Sitchin's books sold millions of copies. They inspired countless documentaries, television series, and an entire subculture of ancient astronaut theorists. But they also drew withering criticism from the academic community. Sumerologists, linguists, and historians pointed out that Sitchin had no formal training in ancient languages. His translations were not based on accepted lexicons. He consistently mistranslated Sumerian and Akkadian words, inventing meanings that served his narrative. The word Anunnaki, scholars stressed, does not mean those who from heaven came. It means princely offspring or those of royal blood. The term refers to their divine lineage, not their place of origin. Nibiru in Babylonian astronomical texts does not refer to a 12th planet on a long elliptical orbit. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, Nibiru is a celestial station or crossing point associated with the god Marduk and most likely refers to the planet Jupiter or a specific celestial location marking the equinox. There is no ancient text that describes the Anunnaki mining gold or creating humans as slaves. These are fabrications extrapolated from misreadings of metaphorical and poetic language. The academic consensus is clear and unambiguous. Sitchin's theories are not supported by the evidence. They are, in the words of Dr. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages, demonstrably wrong. But here is where the story takes an intriguing and deeply controversial turn. Even if Sitchin's specific claims about Nibiru and alien astronauts are rejected, his work forced a question into public consciousness. A question that mainstream scholars had been quietly discussing for decades. What is the relationship between the gods of Mesopotamia and the God of the Bible? Let's return to the question of Yahweh's origins, but this time through a different lens. Not the lens of ancient astronauts and interplanetary mining operations, but through the lens of cultural transmission, religious syncretism, and the uncomfortable truths that emerge when we compare ancient texts side by side. The Hebrew Bible, particularly the Book of Genesis, did not emerge in a vacuum. It was written down during and after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, though it draws on much older oral traditions. The Israelites, exiled to Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BCE, found themselves immersed in the dominant culture of Mesopotamia. They encountered Babylonian cosmology, Babylonian law codes, and Babylonian mythology. And the parallels between biblical narratives and earlier Mesopotamian myths are impossible to ignore. The biblical story of creation in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 bears striking resemblances to Mesopotamian creation accounts. The Enuma Elish describes the god Marduk defeating the chaos dragon Tiamat and splitting her body to create the heavens and the earth. The biblical account describes God dividing the waters above from the waters below and creating the firmament. The Hebrew word for the deep Tehom is linguistically related to Tiamat. The story of Noah's flood in Genesis chapters 6 through 9 is an almost exact parallel to the flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which itself draws on the earlier Sumerian flood myth found in the Atrahasis epic. Both describe a god or council of gods deciding to destroy humanity with a flood. Both feature a righteous man warned by a friendly deity. Both describe the construction of a massive boat sealed with pitch. Both include the sending of birds to find dry land. Both conclude with a sacrifice that pleases the gods. The parallels are so precise that scholars universally agree that the biblical authors knew and adapted these Mesopotamian stories. The question is not whether there was influence, but what that influence means. From a mainstream scholarly perspective, the biblical authors took older myths and reworked them to promote a monotheistic theology, to proclaim that Yahweh alone was God, and that the forces described in polytheistic myths as multiple deities were actually just different aspects or actions of the one true God. But the alternative perspective asks a more provocative question. What if the biblical authors weren't creating monotheism from polytheism? What if they were rebranding? What if Yahweh was not a new revelation, but an old god given a new exclusive contract. This brings us to the most explosive claim in the alternative theory, that Yahweh was, in fact, one of the Anunnaki, specifically that Yahweh is another name for Enlil, the Sumerian god of wind, storm and earth. The evidence cited for this identification comes from several directions. First, there are the personality and behavioural parallels. Enlil is described in Sumerian texts as stern, authoritarian, and often angry with humanity. He is the god who decides to destroy mankind with a flood because their noise disturbs his rest. He values order, obedience, and proper worship. He is the enforcer, the lawgiver, the one who demands absolute submission. Compare this to the portrayal of Yahweh in the Old Testament. Particularly in the Torah and the historical books, Yahweh is frequently depicted as jealous, wrathful, and quick to punish. He destroys cities, sends plagues, and commands the Israelites to wage wars of extermination against neighbouring peoples. He demands exclusive worship and threatens dire consequences for disobedience. The famous Ten Commandments begin not with a philosophical statement about God's nature, but with a possessive declaration. I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods before me. This is not the language of a universal cosmic principle. This is the language of a specific deity claiming ownership over a specific people, in explicit acknowledgement that other gods exist but must not be worshipped. Second, there is the flood narrative. In the Sumerian and Babylonian accounts, it is Enlil who decides to destroy humanity and Enki who saves mankind by warning Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim. In the biblical account it is Yahweh who sends the flood, but also Yahweh who saves Noah. The alternative theory suggests that the biblical writers conflated the roles of Enlil and Enki into a single deity to create the appearance of monotheism. They took the destructive aspect from Enlil and the saving aspect from Enki and attributed both to Yahweh. Third, there is the geographical connection. The Hebrew Bible repeatedly states that Abraham, the patriarch of Israel, came from Ur of the Chaldees, a Sumerian city in southern Mesopotamia. The city of Ur was closely associated with the moon god Nana or Sin, but the region was firmly within the sphere of Enlil's religious dominance. Nippur, Enlil's cult centre, was the religious heart of all Sumer. According to the alternative narrative, Abraham was not just a man who left Mesopotamia. He was a priest or initiate of the Mesopotamian religious system who brought the worship of Enlil, under a new name Yahweh, to Canaan. Fourth, there are the titles and epithets. Enlil was called Lord of the Command, King of heaven and earth, and Father of the gods. Yahweh is called Adonai, meaning my Lord, Elohim, a plural form that can mean gods or mighty ones, and El Shaddai, often translated as God Almighty. Many scholars note that Elohim being grammatically plural may preserve a memory of polytheism. Others suggest it's a plural of majesty. But the alternative theory proposes it may simply be an accurate description. Yahweh was not one god. He was the designation for a group, a faction, or a specific member of the Anunnaki Council. This brings us to one of the most controversial passages in the entire Bible. The Psalm 82. It reads, God stands in the divine council. In the midst of the gods he renders judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like men and fall like any prince. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations. This psalm presents a scene of divine judgment in which one god, standing in the council of the gods, condemns the other gods for their injustice and declares that they will lose their immortality and die like humans. For centuries, theologians have struggled to explain this passage within a monotheistic framework. The traditional interpretation is that these gods are either angels who have become corrupt or human judges being addressed with honorific titles. But the alternative reading is far more straightforward. This is a description of a real council of divine beings, the Anunnaki, in which one deity, possibly Yahweh, or possibly a higher authority like El, is stripping the others of their power. It's a cosmic coup, a divine reorganization in which the polytheistic system is being dismantled and one god is asserting supremacy. The implications of this interpretation are staggering. If Yahweh began not as the one true God, but as a member of the Anunnaki pantheon, who successfully asserted dominance over the other gods, then monotheism is not a divine revelation. It's a political victory. But we must pause here and address the elephant in the room. What about the overwhelming scholarly consensus that Sitchin was wrong, that his translations were fabrications, that there is no evidence in the Sumerian texts for alien astronauts or genetic engineering or interplanetary travel? This is where intellectual honesty demands we draw careful distinctions. The alternative theory that Yahweh was one of the Anunnaki does not require us to accept Sitchin's alien hypothesis. We can reject Nibiru, reject the gold mining narrative, reject the ancient astronaut framework entirely, and still be left with a deeply troubling historical question. Was Yahweh originally a god within the Mesopotamian pantheon? Not an extraterrestrial. Just a god. One deity among many in a polytheistic system that the Israelites, or a faction among them, elevated to the status of sole divinity. The mainstream scholarly answer, as we've seen, is more nuanced. Yahweh was not directly one of the Canaanite or Mesopotamian gods. He originated in the south among the Midianites or Kenites and was adopted by Proto-Israelite groups. Over time, as these groups settled in Canaan, Yahweh was syncretized with El, the Canaanite high god. Yahweh absorbed El's titles and functions and eventually became identified as El himself. This process, called religious conflation, is well documented in other ancient cultures, but even this scholarly narrative admits something profound. The God of the Bible did not exist in isolation. He emerged from, competed with, and ultimately absorbed other deities. The revolutionary claim of Judaism was not that Yahweh existed, but that he was the only God who existed. Every other god was declared to be a false idol, a demon, or a misunderstanding of natural forces. Yet the biblical text itself, when read carefully, preserves traces of an earlier reality, a reality in which Yahweh was not alone. Where does this leave us? If we strip away the ancient astronaut theories, if we set aside the claims about gold mining and genetic engineering, we are left with a historical puzzle that scholars openly discuss, though often in technical language that doesn't reach popular audiences. The puzzle is this. The Hebrew Bible, which presents itself as the revelation of the one true God, contains undeniable evidence of Israel's polytheistic past. It references divine councils. It acknowledges that other gods exist, even if it insists they must not be worshipped. It borrows heavily from Mesopotamian mythology, and Yahweh himself bears striking resemblances, in personality and function, to gods from that mythology. The question is not whether these connections exist, they do. The question is what we make of them. To fully understand the controversy, we must examine the actual evidence from the ground, from the stones and clay that archaeologists have unearthed. In 1887 and 1888, archaeologists excavating at the site of ancient Nippur in southern Iraq discovered thousands of cuneiform tablets in the temple complex dedicated to Enlil. These tablets, dating from the 3rd to the 1st millennium BCE, provided an unprecedented window into Sumerian religion, administration, and daily life. Among them were god lists, hymns, incantations, and administrative records detailing offerings made to Enlil and the other Anunnaki deities. Enlil's temple, the Akur, meaning mountain house, was the most important religious site in all of Mesopotamia for over a millennium. It was here that kings came to be legitimized, where the fates of cities were decided, and where the Tablet of Destinies, a mythical object representing divine authority, was kept. The texts describe Enlil in terms that will sound very familiar to anyone who has read the Old Testament. He is the supreme judge, the one whose word cannot be changed. He is the giver of kingship and the destroyer of cities. He sends storms and controls the agricultural fertility of the land. He demands precise ritual observance and punishes those who fail to honour him. In the Atrahasis epic, one of the most important Mesopotamian texts, Enlil grows angry at humanity because they have multiplied, and their noise disturbs his rest. He sends a series of plagues to reduce their numbers. When these fail, he convenes the Council of the Gods and proposes to destroy humanity entirely through a great flood. The god Enki, Enlil's brother and rival, opposes this plan. Enki believes humanity is worth saving. He goes to a pious man named Atrahasis and instructs him, in secret and in violation of the divine decree, to build a boat. Enki tells him the exact dimensions, how to seal it with bitumen, what supplies to bring, and when the flood will come. Atrahasis obeys, builds the boat, loads his family and animals, and survives the deluge. When the waters recede and Atrahasis makes a sacrifice, the gods smell the sweet savour and gather around like flies. They are hungry. They have had no offerings for days. Enlil, arriving at the scene, is furious that a human has survived. But Enki argues passionately that the plan to destroy all of humanity was unjust. Eventually, Enlil concedes. He blesses Atrahasis and his wife, granting them immortality, and agrees that humanity will be allowed to continue, though with certain population control measures instituted. Now compare this to the biblical flood narrative in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. Yahweh sees that humanity is wicked and decides to destroy them with a flood. But Noah finds favour in Yahweh's eyes. Yahweh instructs Noah to build an ark, gives him the exact dimensions, tells him to seal it with pitch, and specifies what to bring. Noah obeys. The flood, comes. Noah and his family survive. When they disembark, Noah builds an altar and makes a sacrifice. Yahweh smells the pleasing aroma and declares that he will never again destroy all life with a flood. The parallels are not vague echoes. They are point-by-point correspondences. The only major difference is that in the Mesopotamian version, two gods are involved, one destructive and one merciful, while in the biblical version, one god plays both roles. The alternative theory proposes a simple explanation. The biblical authors took the Mesopotamian story and monotheized it. They merged Enlil, the destroyer, and Enki, the saviour, into a single deity, Yahweh. The story was preserved, but the polytheistic framework was erased. This is not a fringe theory, it is the mainstream scholarly explanation for the parallels between Genesis and earlier Mesopotamian literature. The only debate is whether this represents literary borrowing, cultural diffusion, or a shared memory of an even older tradition. But the alternative narrative takes it one step further. What if the biblical authors weren't just borrowing stories? What if they were preserving a memory of actual events, reframed within a new theological context? What if Enlil and Yahweh are not similar because the Israelites copied Mesopotamian myths, but because they are the same entity, remembered under different names by different peoples? This brings us to a crucial piece of evidence. Archaeological discoveries in Israel and Judah from the 8th to 6th centuries BCE have revealed that ancient Israelites worshipped multiple gods alongside Yahweh. Inscriptions found at sites like Kuntilit Adrud and Khirbet el-Kom mention Yahweh and his Asherah, suggesting that Yahweh had a consort goddess, just as El had Asherah in Canaanite religion and Enlil had Ninlil in Sumerian religion. These inscriptions are not from fringe cults. They come from official religious sites, suggesting that polytheism was normative in ancient Israel for much of its history. The biblical prophets spent centuries railing against the worship of other gods, particularly Baal and Asherah. The very existence of these repeated condemnations proves that the people were actively worshipping these deities. If monotheism was original to Israel, why the constant struggle? Why the persistent tendency to return to polytheism? The alternative explanation is that polytheism was original. Monotheism was the innovation, imposed gradually through religious and political reform movements, particularly during the reigns of King Hezekiah and King Josiah in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. These kings centralized worship in Jerusalem, destroyed local shrines called high places, and promoted the exclusive worship of Yahweh. But even they did not claim to be introducing a new god. They claimed to be restoring the true worship of Yahweh and purging foreign corruptions. What if those foreign corruptions were actually the original religion, and the reforms were the innovation? What if the Israelites originally worshipped Yahweh as one god among many, as part of the broader Mesopotamian and Canaanite religious world, and it was only later, under the influence of exilic and post-exilic prophets and priests, that Yahweh was declared to be the only god? The most direct connection between Yahweh and the Mesopotamian gods comes not from Sumerian texts, but from a careful reading of the Hebrew Bible itself, particularly the passages that biblical scholars call the Divine Council texts. We have already examined Psalm 82, but there are others. Psalm 89 describes Yahweh in the council of the holy ones, surrounded by divine beings. 1 Kings chapter 22 describes a vision of Yahweh sitting on his throne with all the host of heaven standing beside him. Job chapters 1 and 2 present Yahweh holding court with the sons of God, among whom is the Satan, meaning the adversary, who is clearly a divine being with independent agency, not yet the devil of later Christian theology. These texts present Yahweh not as the sole God, but as the presiding deity of a divine assembly. He is primus inter pares, first among equals, not necessarily the only deity in existence. This structure is identical to the Mesopotamian divine council, where Anu or Enlil presided over the Anunnaki. The biblical writers inherited this concept and gradually transformed it, turning the other gods into angels, demons, or metaphorical language, but the structure itself remained. Perhaps the most revealing text is Deuteronomy 32 verses 8 and 9, which we mentioned earlier. In the oldest Hebrew manuscripts, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Greek Septuagint, this passage reads, "When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted inheritance." This text explicitly describes a scene in which the Most High, El Elyon, divides the earth among his divine sons. Each god receives a nation. Yahweh receives Israel. This is not monotheism. This is monolatry at best, the exclusive worship of one god while acknowledging others. Or it is henotheism, the belief in many gods but devotion to one. It is only later, through a slow and deliberate theological development, that this plurality is collapsed into singularity. The other gods are declared to be false, non-existent, or subordinate spiritual beings, but the original texts preserve the earlier reality. Now here is where the alternative theorists make their strongest case. They point out that this divine council structure is not merely symbolic or poetic, it reflects a memory of a real political structure. The Anunnaki, in Mesopotamian theology, were not abstract forces. They were administrators. They governed cities, established laws, appointed kings, and received taxes in the form of offerings. Each major city in Sumer had a patron deity. Eridu belonged to Enki, Nippur to Enlil, to the moon god Nana, Uruk to Inanna. These gods, through their human intermediaries, the priest-kings, wielded actual political and economic power. The temples were not just places of worship, they were the central, economic institutions of each city-state, owning vast tracts of land, employing thousands of workers, and controlling surplus agricultural production. When we read that Deuteronomy says the Most High divided the nations among the sons of God, the alternative perspective asks, what if this describes not a theological concept but a historical reality? What if the Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they were, literally divided the ancient world into spheres of influence? And what if Yahweh, Enlil, or one of the other Anunnaki received the territory that would become Israel? This interpretation would explain why Yahweh is so concerned with borders, with land inheritance, with the specific geographic boundaries of Israel. It would explain why he makes a covenant with Abraham that includes not just religious laws, but an explicit land grant. To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. This is the language of a real estate contract, not a universal spiritual principle. It would also explain the Bible's repeated insistence that the Israelites must not worship the gods of other nations, not because those gods don't exist, but because those gods have authority over other territories. Worshipping them is a form of treason, a breach of contract with Yahweh, who has exclusive rights over Israel. The Old Testament is filled with references to the God of Israel, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Lord of hosts, and other titles that emphasize Yahweh's specific relationship with one people. Even when the prophets begin to proclaim Yahweh's universal sovereignty, declaring that he alone is God and that he controls the destinies of all nations, these proclamations are made in the context of explaining why foreign empires are defeating Israel. The argument is not that Yahweh has always been recognized as universal, but that he should be, because he has proven his power by using Assyria, Babylon, and Persia as instruments of his will. This is theology responding to political catastrophe. When Jerusalem fell to Babylon in 586 BCE, it was a theological crisis. If Yahweh was the God of Israel and Israel was defeated, did that mean Yahweh was weaker than Marduk, the god of Babylon? The exilic and post-exilic prophets resolved this crisis by redefining Yahweh. He was not defeated. He orchestrated the defeat as punishment for Israel's sins. And he was not merely the strongest God, he was the only God. All others were illusions. This reframing is brilliant theology, but it also raises the question, what was Yahweh before this reframing? What was the original understanding before the crisis forced a reimagining? The linguistic evidence, when examined carefully, provides additional layers of intrigue. The name Yahweh, represented by the 4 Hebrew letters Yud, He, Vav, He, forming the Tetragrammaton, has an uncertain etymology. The explanation given in Exodus chapter 3, where God tells Moses, "I am who I am," or "I will be who I will be," is generally understood by scholars to be a late theological interpretation, not the original meaning of the name. It's a wordplay, linking Yahweh to the Hebrew verb to be, but it doesn't explain where the name came from. Some scholars have proposed that Yahweh derives from an archaic verb form, meaning he who causes to be, or he who brings into existence, which would support a creator-god interpretation. Others suggest it comes from an Arabic root related to passion, desire, or blowing, which might fit a storm god. But the name itself is not Hebrew. It appears to be foreign, imported from outside Canaan. The fact that the earliest references to Yahweh place him in Edom, Midian, and Seir, all south and east of Israel, supports the theory that the name and possibly the cult came from elsewhere. Intriguingly, there is no consensus among scholars about what Yahweh originally meant or which god, if any, he was originally identified with. But there is one striking linguistic connection that the alternative theorist sees upon. The word Elohim, the most common term for God in the Hebrew Bible, is grammatically plural. It is formed from El, the name of the Canaanite high god, with the plural masculine suffix im. Literally, it means gods or divine beings. In Hebrew grammar, it is used with both plural and singular verbs depending on context. When referring to Yahweh, it usually takes a singular verb, leading most scholars to interpret it as a plural of majesty or intensity, similar to calling a king your majesties. But in some passages, Elohim clearly refers to multiple divine beings. Genesis 1 verse 26 provides one of the most famous examples. God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Who is us? Who is our? Traditional theology explains this as God speaking to his angelic court, or as a plural of majesty. Some Christian interpreters see it as a reference to the Trinity, but the alternative reading is simpler. Elohim is plural because it is plural. The text preserves a memory of multiple gods participating in creation. And if Elohim is plural, then the original theology may have been that a council of gods, the Anunnaki, created humanity, not through genetic engineering as Sitchin claimed, but through divine decree and shaping, as the Mesopotamian creation myths describe. In the Atrahasis epic, the gods create humans by mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk creates humans from the blood of a defeated rebel god, so that humanity can serve the gods and free them from labour. In Genesis, God forms Adam from the dust of the ground and breathes into him the breath of life. The biblical account is more poetic and less explicit, but the basic structure is the same. Humans are created to serve the divine. In Genesis, humanity is placed in the Garden of Eden to work it and keep it, and after the fall they are condemned to toil by the sweat of their brow. In Mesopotamian mythology, humans are explicitly created to bear the labour of the gods. The purpose is identical. And then there is the strange story in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then Yahweh said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old the men of renown." This passage describes divine beings, sons of God, interbreeding with human women and producing hybrid offspring called the Nephilim, who are giants and heroes. The text is terse, almost cryptic, as if the author is referencing a well-known story without needing to explain it. And indeed, the story would have been well known, because it is a standard element of Mesopotamian and Greek mythology. The gods frequently mated with humans, producing demigod offspring. In Mesopotamian texts, several kings claimed divine parentage. Gilgamesh was said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. This Genesis passage is an outlier in the Bible, a fragment of older mythology that was preserved but not fully integrated into the monotheistic framework. Later Jewish and Christian writers tried to sanitize it, interpreting the sons of God as the line of Seth, or as fallen angels, and the Nephilim as evil giants who deserve to be destroyed in the flood. But the plain reading of the text is clear. divine beings bred with humans and produced a hybrid race. If we accept the alternative framework, this passage is not a myth. It's a historical record, perhaps garbled and mythologized but rooted in memory. It describes a time when the Anunnaki, or whatever advanced beings they were, interbred with humans. The resulting offspring, the Nephilim, were the heroes and kings of old, the founders of dynasties and the builders of civilizations. This would explain why so many ancient cultures, from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece to Mesoamerica, have stories of gods descending from the sky, mating with humans and producing hero kings. It's not that these cultures independently invented the same myth, it's that they are all remembering the same events. But we must confront the core question head on. Is there any direct textual evidence that Yahweh was called one of the Anunnaki? The answer depends on how we define our terms. In the Sumerian and Akkadian texts that have been translated and catalogued, there is no deity explicitly named Yahweh. The name does not appear in the god lists, the king lists, the temple hymns, or the mythological epics of Mesopotamia. This is a point that debunkers of the ancient astronaut theory emphasize repeatedly. Dr. Michael Heiser, in his systematic critique of Sitchin's work, has shown that searches of the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature reveal no association between the terms Anunnaki and Yahweh, no association between the Anunnaki and Nibiru, and no texts describing gold mining or genetic engineering. These searches are publicly available. Anyone can verify them. So if there is no direct textual link, what is the basis for the claim? The basis is not direct identification, but structural and functional equivalence. The argument is not that a tablet says Enlil is Yahweh. The argument is that Enlil and Yahweh exhibit the same characteristics, occupy the same role, and their myths follow the same patterns. It's an argument based on comparative mythology and religious history, not on explicit statements. Let us examine the case for Enlil specifically. Enlil is the god of wind and storm, associated with the destructive power of hurricanes and the life-giving power of rain. Yahweh is repeatedly described as a storm god in the oldest biblical poetry. In Judges 5, he causes the earth to quake and the heavens to pour. In Psalm 18, he rides on a cherub, flies on the wings of the wind, and makes darkness his covering. In Exodus 13 and 19, he appears as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and he descends on Mount Sinai with thunder, lightning, thick smoke, and the sound of a trumpet. This is storm god imagery. Enlil is the supreme judge whose word is unalterable. Once he decrees something, it cannot be changed by any other god. Yahweh declares, "I am the Lord, I change not." His decrees are eternal and unbreakable. Enlil is the giver of kingship. In Sumerian theology, no king could legitimately rule without receiving the me, the divine decrees and powers from Enlil at Nippur. Yahweh chooses kings, anoints them, and gives them authority. Saul, David, and Solomon are all explicitly chosen and empowered by Yahweh. Enlil is concerned with proper worship and ritual. He is angered by disruptions, noise, and failures to honour him correctly. Yahweh demands precise observance of the law, including detailed instructions for sacrifices, festivals, and temple service. He strikes dead those who violate the sacred protocols. Enlil sends the flood to destroy humanity. Yahweh sends the flood to destroy humanity. This is the most damning parallel, and it gets more specific. In the Mesopotamian version, Enlil's council of gods meet and swears an oath not to warn humanity. Enki violates this oath to save Atrahasis. In the biblical version, Yahweh alone makes the decision, but then reverses course to save Noah. If we understand the biblical account as a conflation of two gods into one, the story makes perfect sense. The punishing aspect is Enlil. The saving aspect is Enki. The ancient Israelites, or their precursor cultures, knew both these gods but eventually merged them into the single figure of Yahweh. But here is the problem with the Enlil equals Yahweh theory, and it's a problem that the alternative theorists must address honestly. Enlil was not the only storm god in the ancient Near East. Baal, the Canaanite storm god, exhibits many of the same characteristics. Hadad, the Aramean storm god, is virtually identical to Baal. Tashib, the Hittite storm god, rides a bull and wields lightning. Storm gods with similar attributes appear across dozens of cultures, so the parallels between Enlil and Yahweh could simply mean that Yahweh is a storm god. a common archetype, not that he is specifically Enlil. Moreover, there is a crucial difference. Enlil's domain was Mesopotamia, particularly the city of Nippur. If Yahweh was simply Enlil under a new name, we would expect continuity of cult sites. But Yahweh's primary sites, according to the Bible, are Sinai, Jerusalem, and locations in Canaan, far to the west of Mesopotamia. So perhaps the connection is not direct identity, but cultural borrowing. The Israelites, influenced by Mesopotamian culture during the Babylonian exile or through earlier contact, modelled Yahweh on Enlil and other Mesopotamian deities, borrowing attributes and myths, but creating a distinct theological identity. This is the mainstream scholarly view. Yahweh is not Enlil. He is a god who was shaped by exposure to Mesopotamian religious ideas. But the alternative theorists have a response. They argue that the cult sites did move, that the Anunnaki, if they were real beings, were mobile, that they established different headquarters in different periods, and that what we are seeing in the biblical texts is a western branch of the same religious system that originated in Mesopotamia. They point to the biblical statement that Abraham came from Ur, a Mesopotamian city, and suggest that he brought the worship of one of the Mesopotamian gods with him. They note that Melchizedek, the mysterious priest-king of Salem who blesses Abraham in Genesis 14, is described as a priest of El Elyon, God Most High, which is a Canaanite title for El. Abraham acknowledges this priest and pays him tithes, suggesting that Abraham's God and Melchizedek's God are the same. This syncretism, the merging of divine identities, was common in the ancient world. The Babylonians identified their god Marduk with various attributes of other gods until he absorbed many of their roles. The Greeks and Romans identified each other's gods, declaring that Zeus and Jupiter were the same. The Egyptians identified their god Amun with the sun god Ra to create Amun-Ra. So the idea that Yahweh is an identification or merger of El and one of the Mesopotamian gods is not far-fetched. It's how ancient religions worked. And then there is the most uncomfortable question of all. What if none of this, neither the mainstream view nor the alternative theory, is the whole truth? What if the answer is stranger than either side imagines? What if the Anunnaki were not literal extraterrestrials as Sitchin claimed, but also not mere mythological personifications as academics claim? What if they were something else entirely? This is where we enter speculative territory, but it is speculation grounded in the actual strangeness of the texts. The ancient writers describe their gods in very concrete terms. They walk, talk, eat, drink, wear clothes, wield weapons, and live in physical structures called temples. They have emotions, make mistakes, and change their minds. They are not abstract principles or forces of nature. They are persons, yet they also perform feats that seem impossible. They appear and disappear. They fly. They live for extraordinarily long periods. They wield weapons that produce devastating effects described as fire from heaven, pillars of smoke, and terrible winds. They possess objects, like the Ark of the Covenant, that are described in ways that sound technological. The Ark, according to the Book of Exodus, was overlaid with gold, had specific dimensions and components, and could not be touched by unauthorized persons or they would die instantly. Struck down by an effect the text calls Yahweh's anger, but which sounds remarkably like an electrical discharge. They have access to the Me, objects described as containing knowledge, laws, and the fundamental principles of civilization. The Epic of Inanna describes how the goddess Inanna gets the god Enki drunk and steals over 100 Me from him, which she then uses to establish her city Uruk as a centre of power. The Mei are described as things that can be carried, stolen and transferred. They sound less like abstract concepts and more like data storage devices, like ancient hard drives. The alternative theorists, particularly those in the ancient astronaut camp, seize on these details and argue that the gods were using advanced technology. The Me were computers or databases. The weapons were advanced energy devices. The flying chariots and skyboats mentioned in various texts were spacecraft. The temples, particularly the ziggurats, were not just symbolic mountains but functional structures, perhaps communication centres or landing platforms. The mainstream response to this is that the ancient writers were describing their reality using the only vocabulary they had. If you've never seen technology more advanced than a plough, how would you describe a helicopter? You'd call it a flying chariot pulled by invisible horses. How would you describe electricity? You'd call it the fire of the gods. The texts are poetic, symbolic, mythological. They are not meant to be read as technical manuals. But then we have to confront the troubling precision of some of these texts. The dimensions of Noah's Ark in Genesis, the detailed architectural plans for the tabernacle in Exodus, the precise genealogies and chronologies in Genesis and Chronicles, the careful records of astronomical observations in Mesopotamian texts. These are not vague poetic images, they are specifications. Why would a mythological text include the exact dimensions of a boat or a temple unless those dimensions mattered? Unless they were describing something real? And then there are the anomalies that neither mainstream scholarship nor ancient astronaut theory fully explains. The Sumerian King List, which records the reigns of kings before and after the flood, lists antediluvian kings with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, is said to have ruled for 28,800 years. Mainstream scholars dismiss these as mythological exaggerations or symbolic numbers. But what if they are records kept in a different timescale, as Sitchin suggested? Or what if they reflect a different understanding of time, kingship, or even lifespan? The Bible has its own chronological anomalies. The patriarchs in Genesis live for hundreds of years. Adam lives 930 years. Methuselah lives 969 years. Noah lives 950 years. After the flood, lifespans gradually decline until they reach normal human ranges by the time of Moses. Is this pure myth, a symbolic way of showing the gradual decline of humanity from a golden age? Or is it preserving a memory of something real, something we don't yet understand? There are researchers outside the mainstream and outside the Sitchin camp who have proposed other explanations. Some suggest that the gods were not extraterrestrials but a precursor human civilization, a technologically advanced culture that predated known history and was destroyed by a cataclysm, possibly the Younger Dryas impact event around 13,000 years ago. The survivors of this civilization, possessing advanced knowledge, became the gods of later cultures, teaching agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and social organization to the hunter-gatherers of the post-cataclysm world. This theory, sometimes called the lost civilization hypothesis, has been popularized by writers like Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson. It does not require aliens or genetic engineering, but it does require us to accept that mainstream archaeology has the timeline of human civilization wrong, that advanced cultures existed long before Sumer, and that nearly all trace of them was obliterated. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial but intriguing. Megalithic structures like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, predate the supposed invention of agriculture and complex society by thousands of years. The precision engineering of the Egyptian pyramids, the astronomical alignments of ancient sites worldwide, and the presence of flood myths in virtually every culture suggest a shared memory of a global catastrophe. But this theory, like the ancient astronaut theory, struggles to gain academic acceptance because it requires rejecting the established chronology and interpretative framework of archaeology and history. It's revolutionary rather than incremental, and academia, by its nature, is conservative. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence, while suggestive, is not yet definitive. So where does this leave the question of Yahweh's identity? If we reject the alien hypothesis, if we acknowledge that Sitchin's specific claims are not supported by the texts, but we also recognize that the biblical texts preserve unmistakable connections to Mesopotamian mythology, particularly concerning flood narratives, creation accounts, and divine councils, then what are we left with? We are left with the possibility that Yahweh is a cultural heir of the Mesopotamian gods, particularly Enlil, not through direct identity but through the transmission and transformation of religious ideas across cultures and centuries. We are left with the certainty that early Israel was polytheistic and that monotheism was a gradual development, not an original revelation. We are left with the unsettling fact that the biblical writers knew about divine councils, sons of God, and a plurality of divine beings, even as they insisted that Yahweh alone was to be worshipped. We are left with questions that scholarship can describe but not fully answer. Why did monotheism emerge when and where it did? What historical circumstances or theological insights drove the reformulation of Yahweh from one God among many to the only God? And what does it mean for billions of people today whose faith is rooted in the belief that Yahweh is not a latecomer in the pantheon but the eternal creator who has always existed and always been one? These are not idle academic questions. They cut to the heart of religious identity, historical truth, and the nature of divine revelation. For believers in the Abrahamic faiths, the claim that Yahweh has a polytheistic origin is not just an intellectual challenge, it is a theological crisis. If Yahweh was once part of a pantheon, if the biblical texts preserve evidence of this, then what does that mean for claims about revelation, inspiration, and the unique truth of the Bible? The traditional response from conservative religious scholars is to reject the comparative evidence, to argue that the biblical texts are divinely inspired and therefore fundamentally different from pagan mythology. Any similarities are either coincidental, or they reflect the biblical authors correcting and refuting false pagan ideas, or they show that pagan myths are corrupted memories of true events recorded accurately only in the Bible. More liberal religious scholars take a different approach. They accept the historical development of Israelite religion from polytheism to monotheism, but argue that this development was itself guided by God. The progression from many gods to one God, they say, is a story of increasing spiritual insight and maturity, a journey from primitive religion to ethical monotheism. Yahweh did not change. Human understanding of Yahweh changed. But the alternative theorists and secular scholars push back. If the texts themselves show that Yahweh was originally one God among many, then claims about his eternal uniqueness are later theological constructions, not historical realities. And if the flood story, the creation account, and other foundational narratives are borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian sources, then the Bible is not a unique divine revelation, but a cultural product, shaped by its historical context like any other ancient literature. This does not necessarily disprove God's existence or the value of the biblical texts, but it does require a fundamental reassessment of what those texts are and what they mean. Perhaps the most honest conclusion is that the full truth is unknowable with certainty. We have fragments, cuneiform tablets, biblical manuscripts, archaeological remains. We have parallels and patterns. We have scholarly methods that can analyse and compare, but we are looking back across thousands of years trying to reconstruct the beliefs and experiences of people whose worldview was fundamentally different from ours. Did they believe they were worshipping multiple gods because multiple gods existed? Or were they worshipping natural forces, human rulers, or psychological archetypes that they personified as gods? Were the Anunnaki real beings, whether extraterrestrial, advanced humans, or something else? Or were they imaginative creations, mythological explanations for the mysteries of existence? Was Yahweh one of them? Or was he a later development shaped by but distinct from the Mesopotamian tradition? The evidence allows for multiple interpretations, and perhaps that ambiguity is the point. Perhaps the mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be acknowledged. The gods of the ancient world, whether we call them Anunnaki, Elohim, or any other name, were not distant abstractions. To the people who worshipped them, they were present, active, and involved in the world. The temples were their houses, the offerings were their food, the prayers were direct communication, and the stories told about them were not fairy tales but history. What changed was not the gods but us. We stopped seeing them, we stopped hearing them. We reinterpreted their actions as natural phenomena or psychological projections. We declared them myths, but the texts remain, and they whisper of a time when the line between heaven and earth was not so clear, a time when gods and humans interacted directly, a time when Yahweh, whether he was Enlil under a new name, or a southern desert deity who rose to supremacy, or the one eternal God revealing himself progressively, was not a distant creator, but an active presence, walking in gardens, wrestling with patriarchs, and leading armies into battle. Perhaps the real question is not who the Anunnaki were, or whether Yahweh was one of them. Perhaps the question is why we have forgotten, why the gods, who were once so real, so present, have become so distant, and whether, in our quest to demystify the ancient world, to reduce myth to allegory and gods to archetypes, we have lost something essential, something that the ancients understood but we have forgotten. In the end, the claim that Yahweh was an Anunnaki god cannot be proven or disproven with absolute certainty. The direct textual evidence does not exist. But no cuneiform tablet says Enlil travelled west and became known as Yahweh. But the indirect evidence, the structural parallels, the mythological overlaps, the archaeological traces of Israel's polytheistic past all point to a complex religious history that the biblical texts only partially reveal. The mainstream scholarly consensus is clear. Yahweh originated outside Canaan, likely in the southern regions of Edom and Midian. He was adopted by proto-Israelite groups, syncretized with the Canaanite god El, and gradually elevated to the status of the sole god through a process of religious reform and theological innovation. This process was complete by the post-exilic period, and the texts were edited to reflect this monotheistic understanding, though traces of the earlier polytheism remain. The ancient astronaut theory, as proposed by Sitchin, is rejected by scholars because his translations are inaccurate, his methodology is flawed, and his central claims about Nibiru, gold mining and genetic engineering are not supported by the texts. But the broader question of whether ancient gods were misunderstood natural phenomena, personified human rulers, or something else entirely remains open. The provocative thesis that Yahweh is the same as Enlil, or another Mesopotamian god, is not mainstream scholarship, but it is also not entirely baseless. It rests on the recognition that the biblical texts emerged from a milieu deeply influenced by Mesopotamian culture, and that the God of the Bible, in his earliest depictions, shares significant characteristics with Mesopotamian storm and sky gods. Whether this reflects direct identity, cultural borrowing, or parallel development of similar religious archetypes is a matter of interpretation. What cannot be disputed is that the Bible preserves a memory of a time when the divine world was plural, when Yahweh had a council, when other gods existed, and when the boundaries between divine and human were more fluid. The biblical authors and editors worked to erase this plurality, to insist on the exclusive sovereignty of Yahweh, and to declare all other gods false. But the traces remain, embedded in the texts, preserved in the poetry, visible to anyone willing to read carefully. For the believer, this presents a choice. Accept the scholarly evidence and adjust theological understanding accordingly, acknowledging that Scripture reflects a human process of theological development, or reject the scholarly evidence, insisting that the text must be read through the lens of later monotheistic orthodoxy. For the skeptic, this is evidence that religion is a human creation, that gods are cultural constructs, and that the Bible is mythology no different from the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish. For the inquirer, the truth-seeker who is neither committed believer nor hardened skeptic, this is an invitation to look deeper, to read the ancient texts with fresh eyes, to ask uncomfortable questions, and to recognize that the origins of our religious traditions are far stranger, far more complex, and far more fascinating than we have been told. The Sumerian tablets prove nothing definitively, but they reveal everything about how we got here, about how a pantheon of gods became one god, about how myths became scripture, and about how Yahweh, whether he was Enlil or not, whether he was an Anunnaki or an independent deity, became the central figure of Western religion. The truth they hid from you is not that aliens created humanity. The truth is simpler and more profound. The God you worship has a history. He emerged from a world of gods, competed with them, absorbed them, and eventually declared himself to be the only one. Understanding that history does not destroy faith, but it does change it. It transforms religion from a set of eternal, unchanging truths into a living, evolving human engagement with the divine, shaped by culture, politics, and the relentless human need to understand our place in the cosmos. And perhaps that is a more honest, more powerful foundation for faith than the illusion of certainty. But we cannot end this journey without addressing the most compelling pieces of evidence that fuel the controversy. Evidence that exists not in ancient texts alone, but in the archaeological record itself, in the astonishing achievements of ancient civilizations that continue to baffle modern engineers and scholars. The ancient structures that some say could only have been built with knowledge or assistance from the Anunnaki. The megalithic temples, the precision engineering, the astronomical alignments. These are not merely theories based on translated tablets. These are physical realities we can see and touch today. Let us examine the most significant sites and artifacts that the alternative theorists point to as proof of advanced intervention in ancient times, and let us also examine how mainstream archaeology explains these same phenomena. We begin in Iraq, at the ancient city of Ur, one of the most important Sumerian city-states and the supposed birthplace of Abraham, according to the Bible. Ur was excavated extensively by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 30s. What he found there was remarkable. A sophisticated urban civilization dating back to approximately 4000 BCE, massive ziggurats, intricate jewellery, advanced metallurgy, and evidence of long-distance trade networks extending across the ancient world. The ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, was a colossal stepped pyramid structure built from millions of mud bricks. Its base measured 210 by 150 feet and it rose to a height of over 70 feet, with a temple shrine at its summit where the god was believed to dwell. The construction required sophisticated architectural knowledge, including the use of weep holes for drainage to prevent water damage to the mud brick core, bitumen waterproofing, and careful orientation to cardinal directions. The mainstream explanation for Sumerian architectural achievement is straightforward. The Sumerians were brilliant engineers who developed their skills over centuries through trial and error, learning from failures, studying the properties of materials, and accumulating knowledge that was passed down through guilds of craftsmen and priestly architects. The ziggurats were not built overnight. They were often constructed in stages over generations, with each successive ruler adding to the structure. But the alternative theorists ask why the very earliest Sumerian structures show such sophistication. Why does the archaeological record not show a clear progression from primitive to advanced? Why does it seem that Sumerian civilization appeared suddenly, fully formed, around 3200 BCE, with writing, mathematics, astronomy, law codes and monumental architecture all emerging within a relatively short period? This phenomenon is what historians call the sudden civilization, and it is one of the central pieces of evidence that Sitchin and others cite for the Anunnaki, intervention theory. They argue that the Sumerians did not develop these skills gradually. They were taught by the Anunnaki, the gods who brought civilization from the heavens. Moving west to Egypt, we encounter even more extraordinary structures. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built during the 4th dynasty reign of Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE, is an engineering marvel that continues to astound researchers. The pyramid originally stood at 481 feet tall and was the tallest man-made structure in the world for over 3,800 years. It consists of approximately 2,300,000 limestone blocks, each weighing between 2 and 70 tons, fitted together with such precision that in many places you cannot insert a knife blade between the stones. The pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a single degree, more precise than the alignment of the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. It incorporates the mathematical constant pi in the ratio of its height to its perimeter, though pi was supposedly not discovered until centuries later, and it sits on a foundation that is level to within less than 1 inch across its 13-acre base. How did the ancient Egyptians, using copper tools and without wheeled vehicles, cranes or iron, quarry, transport and position these massive stones with such precision? Mainstream Egyptology proposes that the blocks were quarried using copper chisels, wooden wedges and pounding stones. They were transported on sledges pulled over wooden rollers or lubricated sand. They were lifted into place using ramps, either straight ramps that grew longer as the pyramid rose, circular ramps that spiraled around the structure, or internal ramps built into the pyramid itself. These methods are theoretically possible, and there is some archaeological evidence for ramps and sledges, but critics point out that no definitive evidence of ramps large enough to reach the upper levels of the Great Pyramid has ever been found. The amount of material required for a straight ramp to the top would exceed the material in the pyramid itself, and the precision of the stonework, particularly in the interior chambers like the King's Chamber with its enormous granite beams weighing up to 80 tons, seems to exceed what could be achieved with the proposed methods. The alternative theorists propose that the ancient Egyptians had access to advanced knowledge or technology. Some suggest lost ancient techniques like sound levitation or the use of geopolymers, a type of early concrete that would allow the blocks to be cast in place rather than quarried and moved. Others go further and suggest direct intervention by the Anunnaki or another advanced civilization. The fact that the Egyptians themselves credited the gods, particularly Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing, with teaching them the arts of civilization lends support to this view. Thoth was said to have written books of sacred knowledge that contained all the secrets of the universe. If we interpret Thoth not as a mythological figure but as a real teacher from an advanced culture, the Anunnaki or a lost precursor civilization, then the Egyptians' own testimony supports the alternative narrative. Then there is the Sphinx, the great lion with a human head that guards the Giza Plateau. Mainstream Egyptology dates the Sphinx to the same period as the pyramids, around 2500 BCE, and attributes its construction to Pharaoh Khafra. But this dating has been challenged by geologists who have studied the weathering patterns on the Sphinx's body. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, conducted a detailed analysis of the erosion on the Sphinx in the early 1990s. He concluded that the primary weathering was caused by water, specifically by prolonged rainfall, not by wind and sand as would be expected in the current desert climate. The last time the Giza Plateau experienced the kind of sustained rainfall that could produce this erosion was during the African humid period, which ended around 3000 BCE in Egypt, and even then the rainfall was not heavy enough. To produce the observed erosion would require going back to the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. If Shock is correct, the Sphinx is thousands of years older than Egyptology claims. This would mean that an advanced civilization existed in Egypt long before the pharaohs, a civilization that was later forgotten or whose knowledge was inherited by the Egyptians. This fits with the ancient Egyptians' own traditions. They spoke of the first time, a golden age when the gods walked the earth and taught humanity. They spoke of the Zep Tepi, the epoch of the gods, which supposedly occurred thousands of years before the first pharaonic dynasties. Were these just myths, or were they memories of a real advanced culture that was destroyed by the cataclysms at the end of the Ice Age? The mainstream response to Shock's work has been to dispute his interpretation of the erosion, arguing that it can be explained by other factors including sand erosion, chemical weathering and restoration work done in ancient times. But Shock has stood by his findings, and the debate continues. The point is not to definitively prove that the Sphinx is older than believed, but to show that there are legitimate scientific questions about the timeline of ancient civilizations, questions that, if answered affirmatively, would require a complete rethinking of human history. And if human history must be rewritten, then the possibility that the Anunnaki or another advanced culture played a role becomes more plausible. Let us journey further east to the ancient city of Baalbek in modern Lebanon. Here stand the ruins of a Roman temple complex built on a foundation of enormous stone blocks that defy easy explanation. The foundation platform, known as the Trilithon, consists of 3 massive limestone blocks, each weighing approximately 800 tons. These are among the largest building stones ever used in construction anywhere in the world. They are fitted together so precisely that the joints are nearly invisible. The Roman structures built on top of this platform are impressive, but they are small compared to the megaliths beneath them. The Romans themselves acknowledged that they did not build this foundation. They built on top of a pre-existing platform that was already ancient in their time. Who built it? Local legend attributes the construction to giants or to the gods themselves. The alternative theorists point to Baalbek as evidence that an advanced technology existed in pre-Roman times. The precision cutting and moving of 800-ton stones is beyond the capabilities of ancient tools as we understand them. Even modern cranes would struggle with such weights. How were these stones quarried from a hillside over half a mile away, transported to the site and lifted into position? Mainstream archaeology proposes that the foundation was built by the Phoenicians around the 1st millennium BCE, using large numbers of workers, rollers, levers and pulleys. But this explanation is considered unsatisfactory by many engineers who have studied the site. The forces required to move such massive stones would crush wooden rollers. The leverage needed would require impossibly long levers, and no marks from the proposed tools have been found on the stones. The alternative explanation is that either the stones were cut and moved using lost ancient technology, possibly involving sound vibration or electromagnetic manipulation, or that they were constructed by a civilization with capabilities far beyond what we attribute to ancient peoples. The Anunnaki, in this framework, would have possessed such technology, and Baalbek would be one of their construction sites. Moving to South America, we find even more perplexing structures. The ancient city of Pumapunku in Bolivia, part of the larger Tiwanaku complex, contains stone blocks that exhibit machine-like precision. These are not rough-hewn boulders. They are precisely shaped blocks with intricate interlocking designs, perfectly straight edges, and smooth surfaces. Some blocks have H-shaped grooves cut into them, as if designed to fit together with other blocks in a 3-dimensional puzzle. The stones are made of andesite and diorite, extremely hard volcanic rocks that rank between 7 and 8 on the Mohs hardness scale. Cutting and shaping these stones with copper or bronze tools should be impossible. Copper has a hardness of only 3. You cannot cut stone harder than your tools, yet the surfaces are so smooth and the edges so sharp that they appear to have been machine cut. Mainstream archaeology proposes that the stones were shaped using even harder stone tools, like diorite hammers, combined with sand as an abrasive. This method is possible in theory, but it is extraordinarily labour-intensive and would require an immense amount of time to produce the precision seen at Pumapunku. The alternative theorists argue that the precision is too exact for hand tools and must represent the use of advanced technology. Some have proposed that the ancient builders had access to diamond-tipped tools, though no such tools have been found. Others suggest they used sound or vibrational technology to soften or shape the stone, though there is no evidence for this either. What cannot be disputed is that the stonework is extraordinary, and the techniques used remain a mystery. The Tiwanaku culture, which built Puma Punku around 500 to 600 CE according to mainstream dating, did not have written records, so we have no direct testimony from them about how they achieved this precision. But they did leave one clue. The site is decorated with images of figures that the alternative theorists identify as the Anunnaki or Viracocha, the bearded god who, according to Andean mythology, came from the stars to teach the people agriculture, astronomy and architecture, before departing with a promise to return. Is Viracocha a mythological figure? Or is he a memory of a real teacher from an advanced civilization? These archaeological sites, and dozens of others like them around the world, form the physical evidence base for the alternative theories. They demonstrate that ancient peoples achieved feats of engineering and construction that challenge our understanding of their capabilities. The mainstream explanation is that we underestimate the ingenuity, skill, and determination of ancient peoples, that they accomplished these feats using methods we have not yet fully reconstructed, and that the appearance of impossibility is simply a reflection of our own ignorance. The alternative explanation is that these accomplishments are not just impressive but genuinely impossible using the technology available at the time, and therefore they must represent either lost advanced technology or intervention from a more advanced source, whether that source is the Anunnaki, a lost precursor civilization, or extraterrestrial visitors. The debate hinges on what we believe is possible. If we believe that humans using only stone, copper, and bronze tools, without wheeled vehicles or advanced mathematics as far as we know, could quarry, transport, and precisely position multi-ton stones, then the mainstream explanation is sufficient. If we believe that such feats require technology beyond what those cultures supposedly possessed, then we must look for alternative explanations. And if we are willing to entertain alternative explanations, then the possibility that the gods described in ancient texts were real beings with real capabilities becomes plausible. Not proven, but plausible. Returning now to the textual evidence, let us examine one more critical connection between the Anunnaki mythology and the biblical narrative. The story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. The biblical account is brief. After the flood, all humanity spoke one language. They journeyed to the land of Shinar, which is Sumer, and they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly, and let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." Yahweh came down to see the city and the tower, and he said, "Behold, they are one people with one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." So Yahweh confused their languages and scattered them over all the earth, and they ceased building the city. The mainstream interpretation is that this is an etiological myth, a story designed to explain the origin of different languages and the existence of ruined ziggurats in Mesopotamia. It's a moral tale about human pride and divine judgment. But the alternative theorists point out several intriguing details. First, Yahweh says, "Let us go down," again using the plural, suggesting a council of gods, not a single deity. Second, Yahweh is concerned that if humanity remains united, nothing that they propose to do will be impossible for them. This is a remarkable statement. What could humans do that would threaten or concern a deity? Unless the deity is not all-powerful, not truly divine in the transcendent sense, but a powerful being with limitations. Third, the story specifies that they were building a tower with its top in the heavens. In the Mesopotamian context, this clearly refers to a ziggurat, a temple tower designed to reach toward the sky where the gods dwelt. The ziggurats were believed to be the physical meeting points between heaven and earth, where gods could descend and humans could ascend. In Sitchin's interpretation, the Tower of Babel was not just a temple, it was a launch tower, a communication facility, or a technological structure designed to contact or reach the Anunnaki home planet. When Yahweh or the Anunnaki Council saw that humans were attempting to build this structure independently, without divine authorization, they intervened to stop it. The confusion of languages was not a miraculous linguistic curse. It was a deliberate strategy to prevent coordination among the workforce, ensuring that the project could not be completed. This interpretation transforms the Tower of Babel from a quaint moral fable into a story of technological suppression, a divine decision to prevent humanity from advancing beyond a certain level of capability. It fits with the broader Anunnaki narrative in which humans were created to be servants, not partners or rivals. Any attempt by humans to achieve independence or equality with the gods must be thwarted. But there is a deeper and more unsettling implication here. If Yahweh, whether he is Enlil or another of the Anunnaki, deliberately prevented human technological advancement by scattering the peoples and confusing languages, then he is not acting in humanity's best interest. He is acting to maintain control to keep humanity divided and dependent. This is not the behaviour of a benevolent creator. It is the behaviour of a ruler who fears rebellion. The biblical text itself, read carefully, supports this interpretation. Yahweh's concern is explicitly stated. If humans remain united with one language, nothing they propose will be impossible for them. This is not a statement about moral corruption. It is a statement about capability. Yahweh recognizes that a united humanity is too powerful, too capable, and therefore too dangerous. The solution is divide and conquer. Scatter them, make them unable to communicate effectively, ensure that they can never again coordinate on a massive project that might challenge divine authority. This pattern repeats throughout the biblical narrative. When humanity attempts to gain knowledge, as in the Garden of Eden story, they are punished. When they attempt to build a city and tower, they are scattered. When they become too numerous or too powerful, as in the flood story, they are destroyed or diminished. The consistent theme is divine control and human subjugation. This theme is also present in the Mesopotamian texts. The Atrahasis epic explicitly states that humans were created to bear the labour of the gods. When humans multiply and become too noisy, disturbing the gods' rest, the solution is population control, first through plagues, then through famine, and finally through the flood. The gods, or the Anunnaki, are not nurturing parents. They are masters managing a workforce. If this is the true nature of the relationship between humanity and the divine as preserved in these ancient texts, then what are the implications for modern religion? If Yahweh is Enlil or another Anunnaki, and the Anunnaki are not benevolent creators but self-interested rulers, then the entire foundation of monotheistic faith is called into question. But there is another possibility, one that neither traditional theology nor the ancient astronaut theory fully addresses. What if the stories preserve a memory of a real conflict, not between gods and humans, but between different factions of gods or different groups of advanced beings with different attitudes toward humanity? What if Enki, the god who created and repeatedly saved humanity, represents one faction that views humans as worthy of protection and advancement? And what if Enlil, the god who repeatedly attempts to control or destroy humanity, represents another faction that views humans as a problem to be managed? If Yahweh is a conflation of these two figures, then he embodies this conflict. He is simultaneously the destroyer and the saviour, the jealous tyrant and the compassionate father. This duality is present throughout the Old Testament. Yahweh commands genocide in the conquest of Canaan, but he also insists on justice for the poor and the oppressed. He sends plagues and famines, but he also provides manna and water in the wilderness. He is wrathful and merciful, distant and intimate, a god of war and a god of peace. Perhaps this contradiction is not a theological paradox to be explained away. Perhaps it is the truth. Yahweh is complex, conflicted, multifaceted, because he represents a synthesis of multiple divine figures, multiple traditions, and perhaps multiple real beings whose stories have been merged into one. Understanding this does not resolve the mystery, but it does make the mystery more comprehensible. It allows us to read the biblical texts not as the inerrant word of a perfect deity, but as the product of human beings struggling to understand their relationship with powers beyond their comprehension. And finally, we must address the question that haunts every discussion of the Anunnaki and Yahweh. If the gods were real, where are they now? Why did they leave, or did they leave at all? The ancient texts provide some clues. In Sumerian and Babylonian literature, there is a recurring theme that the gods eventually withdrew from direct interaction with humanity. The age of the gods gave way to the age of men. Kingship descended from heaven, meaning it was granted by the gods, but the gods themselves became more distant. They stopped appearing in person and communicated only through omens, dreams, and prophets. In the Bible, a similar pattern emerges. In Genesis, God walks in the Garden of Eden and speaks directly with Adam and Eve. He appears to Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wrestles with Jacob at Peniel. He speaks to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. But after the giving of the law at Sinai, God's direct appearances become less frequent. He communicates through the pillar of fire and cloud, through the Ark of the Covenant, through prophets and priests. By the time of the prophets and kings, God speaks primarily through visions and prophetic utterances, not direct physical encounters. After the Babylonian exile, the age of prophecy is said to have ended. God no longer speaks directly. The rabbinic tradition holds that after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, the age of miracles ended. The divine presence, the Shekinah, departed from the earth. Christianity teaches that God made his final definitive communication through Jesus Christ, and after Christ's ascension, the Holy Spirit took over the role of divine presence on earth, working invisibly rather than visibly. Islam teaches that Muhammad was the final prophet, the seal of the prophets, and that divine revelation was complete with the Quran. What this means is that all three Abrahamic faiths acknowledge that direct, visible, physical interaction with God has ceased. God is now experienced through scripture, tradition, ritual, and inner spiritual experience, but not through direct physical manifestation. The alternative theorists have a straightforward explanation for this pattern. The gods, the Anunnaki, left. They completed their work, or they lost interest, or they were recalled to their home world, or they were defeated by the rival factions, or they simply died. The ancient texts were not lying when they said the gods were mortal. The gods could die, and if they could die, they could leave. The mainstream explanation is that this pattern reflects the evolution of human consciousness and religious thought. Humanity outgrew the need for physical gods. We internalized the divine. We moved from a primitive religion of external deities to a mature religion of inner faith. This is the story that theology tells itself, but there is a third possibility, darker and more disturbing. What if the gods did not leave? What if they are still here but hidden? Operating, behind the scenes, manipulating events, maintaining control but no longer showing themselves openly? This is the heart of the conspiracy theory that links the Anunnaki to modern secret societies, to the Illuminati, to the New World Order. The idea that the bloodlines of the Anunnaki, the hybrid descendants of the gods and humans, are the ruling elite who continue to govern the world from the shadows. Sitchin himself hinted at this in his later books, suggesting that the Anunnaki might return when Nibiru's orbit brings it back into the inner solar system. Others have expanded this into a full-fledged conspiracy theory in which world governments are preparing for the return of the gods, building underground bunkers, suppressing evidence of ancient advanced civilizations, and maintaining the illusion of humanity's primitive origins to keep the population ignorant and controllable. There is no credible evidence for these claims. They rest on the interpretation of ambiguous symbols, the reading of hidden meanings into public statements, and the assumption that every major event is orchestrated by unseen hands. But the theories persist because they offer a simple, dramatic explanation for the complexity and injustice of the modern world. If our leaders are controlled by or descended from alien gods, then the suffering and chaos of human history is not random. It is intentional. We are not free, we are still slaves, just as we were created to be. This is a deeply pessimistic worldview, but it is also empowering in a strange way. If the chains are real, they can be broken. If the truth has been hidden, it can be revealed. If humanity was engineered to be servants, we can choose rebellion. We can choose freedom. And here, at the end of this long journey through ancient texts, archaeological mysteries, scholarly debates and alternative theories, we arrive at the real question. Not whether Yahweh was an Anunnaki, not whether the gods were aliens, or advanced humans or mythological constructs. The real question is what we choose to do with the knowledge that our origins are uncertain, that our scriptures have a history, and that the foundations of our faiths are built on older, stranger stories than we have been taught. Do we retreat into fundamentalism, insisting that the texts must be read literally, and that any evidence to the contrary is deception? Do we embrace radical skepticism, declaring that all gods are false and all religion is superstition? Or do we walk the difficult middle path, acknowledging the complexity, living with the uncertainty, and recognizing that truth is layered, that history is ambiguous, and that the divine, if it exists at all, is far stranger and more mysterious than any theology or mythology can capture? The Sumerian tablets do not prove that Yahweh was an Anunnaki god, but they do prove that the world from which Yahweh emerged was a world steeped in the mythology of multiple gods, divine councils, and direct divine intervention in human affairs. The biblical texts themselves preserve this world, even as they try to transcend it. The archaeological evidence does not prove that ancient astronauts built the pyramids or that lost civilizations possessed advanced technology, but it does prove that ancient peoples achieved things we do not fully understand, that they had knowledge we are only beginning to recover, and that our assumptions about the primitiveness of our ancestors may be wrong. The academic consensus does not prove that Sitchin and the alternative theorists are entirely wrong, but it does prove that their specific claims, particularly about Nibiru and literal alien intervention, are not supported by the evidence as it currently stands. What remains, after all the claims and counterclaims are sorted through, is mystery. The mystery of human origins, the mystery of religious development, the mystery of consciousness, of meaning, of our place in the universe. Perhaps the gods were real, perhaps they were not. Perhaps Yahweh was Enlil, perhaps he was not. Perhaps ancient astronauts descended from the sky and created civilization, perhaps they did not. But the mystery is real, the questions are real, and the search for answers, the willingness to question everything we have been told and to follow the evidence wherever it leads, that is real too. That is the truth they hid from you. Not a single shocking revelation, but the invitation to think for yourself, to question authority, whether that authority is religious tradition or academic orthodoxy. To look at the ancient world with fresh eyes and to recognize that we do not have all the answers, that our ancestors were not primitive fools, that the gods, whatever they were taken seriously by billions of people for thousands of years for reasons that demand our respect and our investigation. The tablets are there, the temples stand, the texts endure, the mystery awaits, and the choice of what to believe, of how to interpret the evidence, of whether to see gods or aliens or myths or metaphors, that choice is yours and yours alone. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the deep past. If you found value in this exploration, I would be grateful for a like and a subscription. Let me know in the comments what you think. Are the connections between Yahweh and the Anunnaki compelling? Is there truth hidden in the ancient texts? Or is this all fascinating speculation built on misinterpretation? Share your thoughts, challenge my conclusions, add your own research. Together, we can continue to unravel the mysteries of our ancient past. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and never stop looking for the truth.